Why is everything crashing? Why is your crypto portfolio going down? Of course, it's the evil people in Japan with their strange anime comics. They are changing their interest rates. They help unwinding carry trades. And that's because everybody is selling risk on assets. Do you really believe that? Let's have a look at the data. Let's really have a look at how interest rates are changing. Let's have a look at the impact on the Japanese yen. Let's have a look at the Nikkei. Let's have a look at that, not just in Nikkei points, but actually measured in US dollars. Because does it really make sense that there is so much Japanese leverage both in the Japanese stock market but also globally? What we've got over here is the Nikkei. And yes, this did crash quite a bit. We went down from the 10th of July to today by 23%. What we've got over here is the Japanese yen. So the yen got more valuable because now less people are shorting the yen. The yen went up by 13% in the last few days. But the yen in general is pretty volatile, right? We've seen these kinds of movements quite regularly. In fact, when we look at the DXY, so the dollar strength index, that also went down. Not to the same degree, but it did go down. So it's not just the Japanese yen that's appreciating. Now, what is this carry trade and why are people now unwinding it and why is there leverage that gets out of the system? It's because the central bank in Japan has now increased the interest rate for a second time and people are anticipating that this might continue. So this is historically the Japanese interest rate and it had been at zero since 1999. And it was the first economy to even turn to negative interest rates. This has now changed, but this was not the first increase in interest rates. We had one in March of this year, and now we've got a second interest rate increase. Not a massive increase though, right? We are still at 0.25% per year. It's still super low. Are people really going to pay back their debt because the cost went up by 0.25%? Probably not. Did something fundamentally change about Japanese investments? I don't think so either. This is the Nikkei in US dollars. Here again, it's the same in Japanese yen, right? So there is a slight difference between those two charts. And yes, this hints slightly towards leverage, right? There is more volatility in the US dollar denominated chart. In other words, when the Nikkei goes down, the Japanese yen tends to appreciate and vice versa. But fundamentally, has something really changed? Not really. 4 years ago, we had seen a crash of the Nikkei denominated in US dollars by 29%. And this is just a little bit of a blip. Would this really, in the grand scheme of things, change how the world operates? Is this really going to unwind things? Is this really going to push all of that selling pressure on Ethereum, for example? Do you really believe that it's the Japanese that are to blame that Ethereum went down by 43%? I think the reason is very different. I talked about this also on this channel. I think it's because there are outflows from the Ethereum ETF. Grayscale is selling off their ETF. And of course, when Ethereum goes down, it brings the entire crypto market down as well. I do not think that this is a spillover effect from Japanese carry trades that go all the way down to Ethereum. I think this is a very minute contribution to the crash. Let's have a look at the Japanese stock market return relative to the US stock market return. So this is the Nikkei denominated in US dollars divided by the S&P 500. Fundamentally, nothing has changed. Over the last 9 years, Japanese investments underperformed US investments by 42%, and it's likely going to continue that way. Thus, the carry trade is still attractive. And yes, we have seen an increase in the interest rate, but we have seen what happened in the past, right? When the economy isn't doing that well, that interest rate very quickly goes back down again. And it makes sense that at some point that interest rate has to come down again because Japan is highly indebted. Here's the private debt to GDP ratio in Japan. It's at 245%. So an average household in Japan has 2.45 times its annual income in debt. The Japanese government isn't much better. It's got 2.63 times its annual income in debt. And so there's a strong incentive to keep interest rates low, right? Because once interest rates rise, all of that debt needs to be served. I think this interest rate increase in Japan is rather symbolic. We will not see 2, 3, 4, 5% interest rates in Japan. This is simply just a signal to the population that the central bank is willing to fight inflation a little bit, because there were a bit of inflation numbers in Japan, something we didn't see necessarily that much historically. The correlation between traditional stock markets and the crypto markets is very, very low. In other words, when one thing goes up, the other thing doesn't have to go up, and vice versa. The two variables are relatively independent from one another, which means that the risk factors that drive those two assets are rather different. Here, let's take our US dollar denominated Nikkei and let's have a look at the correlation coefficient to Bitcoin. Let's see how this looks over time. This coefficient is just randomly oscillating. Here's the zero line. Sometimes we are close to 1, sometimes we are close to -1. The two assets really don't move in the same directions whatsoever. There is very little spillover in any direction. Now let's compare this to the S&P 500 relative to the Nasdaq 100. Check this out. This is a very different chart, right? This is pretty much always above 0, most of the time somewhere between 0.6 and 1. So US technology stocks tend to move in the same direction on the same day most of the time. The Nikkei and Bitcoin definitely do not. And so I believe this story is all just noise. The same way how this chart looks like, right? It all looks just like random noise. I don't think that Japan will suddenly start the next financial crisis, and it's definitely not to be blamed for the crypto crash. If it's the first time here, feel free to subscribe. I publish videos regularly. A like would be very much appreciated as well. It helps the channel grow. In case you've got Telegram, feel free to join us as well. There's a public Telegram channel. It's 100% free. Looking very much forward to chatting with you. Cheers.